This delicious lure right here is called the Jig, and let me tell you something, I love me a jig. Oh, there's one. That's 4 casts in a row. Got him. There's one. That one might go 5 pounds. It seems that no matter where I go in the country, I can catch tons of bass and big ones at that on this little nugget of gold right here. But it seems like most of the instructional fishing videos I see on YouTube about the jig are not catered towards the bank angler, they're catered towards the guys in bass boats or kayaks. So in this video, I'm gonna break down the jig to its simplest bare bones form. That way you guys out there can be informed and give yourself the best possible chance of catching your first fish or your biggest fish ever from the bank on the jig. My name's Tyler, and let's talk about it. Another giant, another giant. Look at that, y'all. I can't believe what I just caught. Yes! Well, how's it going, folks, and welcome back to TRF. My goal here on this channel is to help you guys catch more fish, plain and simple, and so if you like that, hit that subscribe button. So like I mentioned in the intro, I think one of the biggest problems with fishing a jig for most people is that they just haven't built the confidence to throw it consistently. Because let me tell you, after watching this video, you're gonna realize that fishing a jig is not that hard. It's just one of those things that you have to put time into, and once you get confident, get comfortable with it, it's gonna be a bass catcher in your tackle box as you walk the bank every single time you go on the water. Now, before we hop in, I gotta say this video is brought to you by Outkast Tackle Jigs. The shirt that you see me wearing right here, Jig Life, that is Outkast Tackle's slogan, and they are all about making jigs. And not just the juice jig that we're gonna be talking about, but all different types of jigs. The best offshore football jig I've ever used, the best Ned rig head, the best hair jig for smallmouth, the best offshore hair jig for largemouth. They make all different kinds of jigs, and I will leave them linked in the video description. I've been working with Outkast for, I think, 4 years at this point, and we have some awesome stuff coming for you guys, so make sure you check them out. A jig in the bass fishing world is comprised of a few different components. It's got some sort of metal head, usually lead, sometimes tungsten, with an eye to tie your line onto. They've got a straight shank hook that makes a turn, usually a thicker wire than most Texas rig hooks, and then you have a weed guard in some form, length, color of skirt. I guess the technical term would be a skirted weedless jig head, but we just call it a jig. And in the jig category, there's tons of different types. There are swim jigs, there are skipping jigs, there are football jigs, there's finesse jigs, there's hair jigs, there's lots of different types of jigs. But for you guys out there, the pond fish, really the only 2 jigs you need are a bottom contact dragon all-purpose jig and a swim jig. And we're not really gonna be discussing the swim jig in detail in today's video. If you wanna see how I work all 4 main different styles of jigs, I will leave that video in the description below. It's basically a masterclass when it comes to jigs. But in this video, we're talking about the standard flippin', pitchin', dragging, casting jig right here called the Outkast Tackle Juice Jig. So in the spirit of keeping it simple, let's just talk about where you throw it, why you throw it, what it imitates, why it works, and what colors you need, and then get on the water and see some fish catches. So why the heck should you be throwing a jig? Well, because it imitates basically everything a bass could be eating in your pond. So if they're eating a bluegill, throw a bluegill colored jig. If they're eating bait fish, throw a white jig and swim it through the water column. If they're eating a crawfish, put some bigger claws on this thing. It can imitate anything a bass is eating. Another reason why a jig works is because it is a naturally unassuming, unobtrusive lure. So a vibrating jig, spinnerbaits, crankbaits, topwaters, they all make noise, have vibration, create a disturbance in the water, and for the most part, a jig doesn't. A jig just kind of swims through the water column, gets dragged or hopped across the bottom, and it doesn't really intimidate a fish, usually doesn't create a reaction strike. What creates the strike is that a jig is realistic. That skirt matched with a trailer, as we're going to talk about on the jig, just creates an incredibly lifelike presentation that seems to fool bass across the country and across the world. So that is why a jig works. Now let's talk about colors real quick. You need black and blue, some kind of darker June bug color. You need some type of bait fish imitation color, so a white, a silver, a gray for your swim jigs, not usually for your jigs that you hop or drag across the bottom. And then for all styles of jigs, you need some kind of green pumpkin, watermelon, really anything that resembles the color of my shirt or the color of the grass behind me. You need jigs that look anything like that. It doesn't have to be watermelon, purple, green, Corvette red sparkle. It can literally just be straight green pumpkin. I've caught so many fish on that. Trust me, you don't need to complicate it. And if y'all are curious why I chose those 3 main colors of jigs, I will leave my color masterclass video in the video description. In that video, I talk about lots of conditions, but mostly water clarity when it comes to throwing different color lures. But if you just want one color jig for all time, peanut butter and jelly is for you. That one is delicious. It works in clear water and dirty water. Now, every single jig out there is going to be a bottom contact contact lure besides the swim jig. The swim jig, for the most part, as the name implies, is supposed to be swimming through the water column. So a swim jig is anywhere from the surface down to, I'd say, 2 to 3 feet beneath the surface. Most of the time though, my swim jigs are within 1.5 feet of the surface. Every other jig, you want to cast out there and let that thing sink to the bottom. I have been in the boat so many times with anglers who are just incredibly impatient and they can't allow their jig to get to the bottom. So just like any other creature bait, any other Texas rig, a jig is meant to be fished on the bottom. So when talking about getting your jig to the bottom, let's talk about weights. Jigs come in all different types of weights, but the 3 most common are going to be 3/8 ounce, 1/2 ounce, and 5/8 ounce. Any one of those jigs is going to be great for your body of water, but for most ponds out there, I would err on the side of 3/8 or 1/2 ounce and leave 5/8 for some of your deeper bodies of water. And why do I say that a 3/8 ounce jig or a 1/2 ounce jig is what you should be throwing? Because most of the time, you're fishing relatively shallow. You don't need anything heavier to get to the bottom. You don't. And especially if you're dealing with any kind of aquatic vegetation that manifests itself, especially during the spring, summer, and fall, in that snotty type grass, that really slimy type stuff, a jig is usually not the lure to go to. And if you have to throw a jig, the lighter you can go will allow you to not collect as much of that slime. But if you have a pond that's totally slimed over, that has aquatic vegetation, hydrilla, milfoil, lily pads across the entire thing, a jig is not the lure for you. Let's talk about when you should throw a jig. An Arky head standard casting jig like this one works best on hard bottom. So I'm talking sand bottom, clay bottom, rock bottom. If you have that in your bodies of water, which most do beyond that beginning part of the bank where that bank maybe slopes off, there might be a grass line there. Beyond that is usually some kind of hard bottom. But jigs don't really excel, especially ones on the bottom, in mud or any kind of slimy, soft bottom. You really want a hard bottom situation. And because of the weed guard, jigs also excel around cover. I'm talking wood, I'm talking lily pads, anything that's not super duper thick. A jig can enter into those and easily trigger a bite from a bass because of its bigger, juicier presence. So let's hop on the water and show you guys how I'm working this exact jig back to me to catch bass. So you want to cast out to your desired depth, strip line like this with your spool open. That way the jig can fall on slack line and not come back to you on a pendulum. You want to reel in your slack, and for the most part, especially when you have slop like this in the water, I like to work it with a little bit of a hop, just like that. Let it sink, 1, 2, let it sink. And it's very short. As you can see, it's about, 5 to 6 inch hops with the tip of my rod, and then I reel in my slack. Let it sit there for a few seconds, hop it, reel in my slack. It is not a big hop like that, and it's also not a drag. Now, if you have clean bottom, like a sand bottom, a rock bottom, you can do more of a drag, but as you see with all the slop in the water, the closer I get with my jig to the bank, the more stuff it's going to come in contact with, and thus impact the look and feel of my jig in a fish's mouth, thus making them less likely to eat it. So like I said, most of the time in ponds, it'll hop like that. And depending on the temperature of the water, you can either hop it slower, like this, and give it more pauses in between your hops or your drags, or if the water's warm, you can just hop it really, really fast, almost not even giving it time to get back down to the bottom, and that can really trigger a reaction from a fish in warmer water. You just really got to find out what your fish want on that day. But like I said, in most ponds, you're going to have some type of vegetation down there on the bottom, and so a drag is not going to be the best technique to retrieve your jig. It's going to be a little hop, and just like that, I got the jig back to the bank with only minimal slime, which of course I peel off just like that to make another cast. Now, one more thing we've been forgetting about the jig is the trailer. A jig is designed to be thrown with a soft plastic trailer. And really, in my experience for ponds, there's only 2 main trailers you need for jigs, and that is a bigger craw and a smaller craw. The bigger craw I have here is a standard size Rage craw, and my smaller craw is going to be a Rage Menace. Keeping this simple, all you need is a big craw and a small craw. And rigging a trailer on a jig is so simple. You're just gonna line up the trailer with the jig, and I try to get the tips of my skirt here to fall right where the action of the trailer starts. So if your trailer has claws like the Rage craw does here, I don't want the skirt to be totally over the claws, because then the claws can't move as much in the water. So this Rage craw right here is good to go basically as it is out of the package, but I like to bite off or twist off the tip of my Rage craw just like that. Throw that away, and once I've done that, I peel the skirt back just like this, and I line up exactly where that hook needs to poke out of my trailer, and that point is going to be where that bend is in the hook right there. So basically I line that up. I kind of notice it's right around this last ridge right there. So then I'm going to feed the hook through my soft plastic, kind of by pinching the weed guard back here, threading it as straight and as much in the middle of my bait as I can to where it reaches that point that it was supposed to poke out at. I poke it out, move that weed guard back, and then I slide that soft plastic up past this little keeper right here. It's usually a lead or a wire piece that is designed to keep your trailers on there for multiple fish. So I slide it, boom, up past that. Then I usually give it another push, a little bit of a pinch on those two pieces of lead to enable that trailer to stay on there, so if I pull it, it's not coming off. Then you shake the skirt down and you have a beautiful jig and trailer. Now when it comes to rod, reel, and line for your jig, what is a necessity and what is just superfluous? Well, what is a necessity is a rod that's a medium heavy. Not saying you can't catch one on a rod that's a medium, but a jig, like I mentioned, has a significantly thicker hook and it takes a little more power to get that jig into a fish's mouth than it does a standard Texas rig, a wacky rig, a crankbait, spinnerbait. All those lures tend to penetrate a little bit easier. But because of the weight of a jig, most of the time 3/8 ounce, that's more weight than you usually throw on a Texas rig, it takes a little more oomph per se to get the hook into the fish. And so what you're gonna need is a medium heavy rod. For the most part, especially on a long hook set, I want a little bit longer of a rod. So a 7-foot medium heavy is the shortest and the weakest rod I go. Most of the time, my favorite jig rod is actually a 7'3" or 7'4" heavy with a little bit softer of a tip, maybe a fast tip, not an extra fast tip. For line on a jig, I never go below 15-pound fluorocarbon. From some of the fish catches I've had over the past few weeks, using this combo right here, I've had to set the hook pretty dang hard. I still feel a little bit of stretch in this line, so if I could go 17-pound, which I probably can, I should, and so should you. And gear ratio on your reel doesn't really matter. I would say anything in the 6s to 7s. And the most important thing with landing these fish, I've already mentioned it, but I'm gonna say it again, it is hook set, hook set, hook set. You gotta reel your line down all the way to eliminate that slack and absolutely give them the business, which is why it's important to have good quality line. Now this bank you see right here is a great place to throw a jig. Why, you ask? Well, because it is deeper water and all these sticks that have been cut down from landscapers have been thrown into the water, and more than likely a few of these sticks have fallen into deeper water, thus making fantastic deeper habitat and a great place to throw a jig. Now due to a jig's weight, it is one of the more heavy lures you're gonna fish along the bottom of your body of water, and so because of that, it has a tendency to want to get stuck, to get snagged on whatever's down there, whether it's in between rocks, whether it's in a patch of grass, or in and around sticks and wood like you see me fishing today. And so how do you avoid that? Well, when you are hopping or dragging that jig, you'll start to feel a little bit of pressure. Oftentimes that can be the edge of a stick or a rock. Could be a fish. Make sure you reel down there and check to make sure it feels a little different. And if it's not a fish, you're probably about to get snagged if you don't do this tip right here. And that is to give it some small hops with rapid succession and then one big hop. Oftentimes that kind of lets that jig start to work its way over the cover, and then the one big hop lets it totally get free of that scenario. And if you do end up getting snagged, oftentimes flicking your line like this will help get that jig unstuck, or going to the other side from where you are stuck. So let's say I get stuck on this branch right here. I'm hopping it like this, isn't coming out. So I'm gonna come over here to a different angle, hop it, and look at that, the jig came out. So you either want to pull the jig back with some repetition or switch angles, pull again, and you'll oftentimes free that jig. And I'm going to repeat one more thing again, and that is that a jig takes confidence. It might collect slime faster than your Texas rig. It might get snagged more than your Texas rigs. But I'm telling you, once you develop that confidence in the jig, you can know in your mind, I'm going to go to this pond today, it's got a hard bottom, and gosh darn it, if I fish this thing hard enough around cover, around hard bottom, around structure, I will catch bass, and oftentimes you'll catch the biggest ones in your body of water. Big bass, love a jig. That's why I'm all about that jig life. There's one. Bring it on up in here. Yes, sir. Jig, top of the mouth, right next to the eye. He was not coming off. Beautiful. Gosh, that was stinking cool. Wow. The jig is not just for casting, folks. I flipped that sucker in there. That thing was right there. Pulled up to hop it and my line was going this way. Gosh, there was a fish there. Wow, I totally thought that was a stick. Gosh, there's one, get in here. Yes, sir, let's go. Right at the base of those sticks is a jig fish, and what a beautiful specimen. I mean, look at the absolute chunkiness. That right there is the juice jig at work. Gosh, there's one, yes, let's go, baby. Oh, sorry. Ooh, beautiful. Top of the mouth, swimming it next to some shallow cover. You can swim a jig, you can flip a jig, you can cast a jig, you can do whatever the heck you want, man. That's why I like it in ponds so much. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video and learned something about fishing a jig. If you want to see a very similar video to this one talking about the 4 main styles of jigs, I will leave that one up here in this corner. And if you want to see a swim jig video, like I said, swim jigs are great for ponds as well, especially if you have a very snotty, slimy pond. I will leave that one up in this corner for you guys to check out. My name's Tyler. It's always a pleasure to teach you guys how to catch more bass, and we'll see y'all next time right here on TRF.